All right, thank you guys for coming. I'll do a little introduction on myself, and then we'll go through both designing a space from the ground up and doing production design like in a space that already exists. So we can kind of go through both of those things. But I'm Jaina Cipriano. I'm an artist. I'm over at Western Ave currently making really big things in a space that's way too small for me. I am a photographer, a filmmaker, a designer, a fabricator, but I think of myself mostly as a world builder. I really like to create spaces, whether that's through writing or through designing and kind of doing everything. It's been a big learning curve for me to learn how to use a team in my work. I started out doing photography at a very young age. I went to the New England School of Photography, which was in Boston, but it doesn't exist anymore. It's totally gone. And I studied photography there, and I really was working towards being a photojournalist. That was what I was interested in. I thought that if you altered what was in front of the camera, then it was not truthful. We talked a lot about a lot of photographers. I have some books upstairs you guys can look through when we're done here, but a lot of photographers who will build spaces and work inside of them. And I was like, oh, that's phony. That's so fake, which is so funny now that I like look at what I'm doing now. So I studied photojournalism, and then it was sometime in my early 20s, there was this big switch. I think it was a big switch in my life. Like I felt like things were feeling really out of control for me, and I was looking for something to control. So I wanted to, instead of waiting for things to happen to me, I wanted to make the things happen and then create in those spaces. So I started out by throwing these parties in my apartment where I would design spaces, and each one would have a theme. And we had one room I filled up to here with balloons, and we had like a room that was full of cakes and like a wall of presents and things like that. And I got my landlords were all very angry at me, and I made these huge messes. But it was just something like it just felt like everything in me came alive. Like I was like, this is what I want to do. Like it's not the photos as much as it is the space. Like the photos are a catalyst to the space. And then I had to move out of those apartments, and I moved back home with my parents, and they were like, you're not, having like a cake smashing party in our house. And I was like, yeah, I understand. I understand that. So I started building smaller scale spaces for one-on-one shoots with models. And it was great. It was great. And so that has transitioned for me. That was probably, I started building spaces probably 5 years ago. And now I'm working on opening up Finding Bright Studios, and we build sets for music videos and short films. And this is one of the spaces that we built, but it was probably about 2 years ago that my photos started feeling really stationary to me. So I moved into filmmaking. And so I started by like writing and directing my own short films, and that kind of brought me into a community where these are some screenshots from, this is my film Trauma Bond that comes out this fall, but this kind of moved me into a community where space and design was really important, which was something that in the photo community, it can be sometimes an afterthought, like, which is where I was, when I was doing photojournalism stuff. So it's really great to be part of this film community where what you see on the screen is very important. And if you work with good people, then most people also feel that way too. This is the tiny room that we built this summer. But that's kind of how I got to where I am now. So I've kind of just like amassed a team of people that work on projects with me. And we've done a few music videos, we've done a few short films. But what I really like to do is I like to build the space for other people to create their content inside of. Okay, so we'll start by talking about production design. Does anyone know what production design is? I'll tell you. Production design is pretty much everything that you see on screen. So it's all of the props and the sets and the locations and the costuming and the hair and makeup. It's really like what creates the image that you're viewing on the screen. It gives a film a sense of place. you know, it's what the camera looks at, it's where the actresses exist. Really, if you are the designer of a film, you're what's making the movie real. That's what I think. I think other departments might disagree with me, but that's how I feel. When you're working as a production designer, you're a department head, so you get a script really early on, and you'll read the script, and then you get to decide essentially what the film looks like. So there's questions I ask myself, like, where are we in time? Where are we in space? Where are we emotionally? If this is a character space, what does the space say about them? You know, are we in a bedroom? Are we in a bathroom? Like, who owns this house that we're in? Is it a real space? Is it an imagined space? So is it a space that exists in a dream? So maybe there's no rules, or is it a space that exists in the world and so there are rules, like it's a recording studio or it's an office or something like that. When you're working on a lot of low budget stuff, as I am, oftentimes you have to work with what you have. So we'll go and we'll do a location scout and someone will be like, yeah, like my mom is letting us use her house for this film or something. And it's like, great. So there's not a lot I can do here, you know, with like a $300 budget and a mother who's really worried about us stealing her stuff. The director, who's her son, was always like, my mom says like nobody can steal anything from the house. And I was like, okay, it's not gonna steal anything. So when I walk into someone's space, I have questions I ask myself, you know, like, does the space need to feel heavier or lighter? Do we want to open up the room? Do we want to close up the room? How do we want the audience to feel in this space? One of the reasons that I love working with space so much is it's so versatile. It's so emotional. Like, even if you think about, forget, you know, creating space for screen, but just like places that you guys go, like if you go to like your high school at night, it has like a different feel than it feels during the day. Or if you go inside someone's house and they're not there yet, like places can evoke emotion. And I think that's just such a fun place to play. So when we're working on low budget stuff, a lot of times there's not a lot of money to go out and buy like big props or really change the space that we're existing in. So I think color, and this applies too to like when you're building stuff, but color is a really cheap way to make things look really intentional and expensive. So if you're working on location, I often will ask, like, what is the color palette of the space that we're in? Like the short film that I did a few weeks ago, there's a lot of that like yellow, old lady yellow like walls, you know what I mean? And I was like, this is not great. So, but instead of trying to repaint her whole house, I went and I sourced, mostly from Savers and thrift stores in my like basement of perpetual things. I went and I sourced some things so I could try and make a color palette, like using that as a base. So I brought some vases and some flowers and some photos on the wall that just kind of like made that yellow color feel a little less like harsh and a little bit more intentional. This is a music video that I did. It was a low budget music video, which it was still like a $50,000 music video, and it was still like pretty low budget. We worked in the Verb Hotel in Boston, and it was like the pictures on the walls are insured, so you can't remove them. Obviously, like the bed is bolted to the walls, so I can't remove these things. And I had asked the director like 15 times before we went into the space. I was like, so this is a hotel room, right? Like, we're gonna play it as a hotel room. Like, you don't want me to bring stuff that'll make this space look like it's not a hotel room, right? He's like, no, we're in a hotel. It's no problem, And I was like, okay. And then on the day, we're in the room and I'm starting to set up, and he comes in, he's like, do you think it could be a condo? And I was like, yeah, all right, okay, sure. So we did our best, and if you work with a good DP, like we kind of worked together. So I'm like, okay, Ben was my DP. So I was like, it's now a condo. So the 2-bed thing, like we can't show the 2 beds because then it's obviously a hotel room. But this was like a good chance to bring in like a lot of props. Like I brought in this rug and the roses. They really wanted the roses, and all these little things to accentuate like the space. Working off the room, I went around the whole hotel too and like looked at the color palette in the hotel. There's like a lot of painted glass. There's like the umbrellas. So I tried to create a cohesive color palette throughout the whole music video, which I think kind of worked. It's tough working with a big team because oftentimes I think you'll find as like a production designer, the other departments are kind of like, yeah, like sure, like okay, and you're like, no, really, like we really all ideally should all be communicating like through the end of this project. Like we talk so much about the stained glass here, and then like you barely notice it. Like they were like the directors were so like, oh, this like the whole reason we're at this location, like the stained glass, and then you watch the video and it's like you barely notice it. And, like really could have been more of a conversation, but that's neither here nor there. So the audience is going to interpret your use of color. So being cohesive, making sure that things feel good together, I think is the number one thing. And remembering that colors are really subliminal and they're going to make us feel things. So if anyone's ever studied like marketing, you know, all of the lovely monopoly brands in America use different colors, but there's a lot of like psychology behind color. I have this chart here that I actually can read, which is great. So does somebody want to tell me their favorite color in relation to this chart? And I'll tell you what it means. You like green a lot? You like the dark green or the lighter green? You like the dark green? The dark green is supposed to evoke safety and harmony, stability, reliability, and balance. And it's used to relax, balance, revitalize, encourage, and possess.
Now, do you reference the chart often? Like, I mean, obviously, like red, you could often talk like, you know, like angry, like passionate, but like, would you have known that, like, offhand, like, yeah, dark green?
I feel like for me, it's a lot. I just kind of go off like my instinct and more of my emotion. I feel like there are people who really operate off of like really deep color psychology. To me, I feel like it's more of like a feeling thing. Like green definitely feels like a much calmer color to me than like red does. But like speaking of that, like if you guys have seen Breaking Bad, I assume like most, you know, like human beings, we've seen Breaking Bad. But Breaking Bad does this a lot with color, like they do it in a lot of different ways, but one of the interesting, and I feel like I'm kind of on the fence about this. Like I'm not sure what this adds to the film. Like one of my friends thinks this is like the coolest thing, but you can kind of predict what's going to happen by like what colors the main characters are wearing or like what colors are around them. So a lot of times like orange is a sign of like warning and danger. So characters will wear them like before something really awful happens, or they'll be wearing green to like show how like desperate or envious they are. Or like there's that scene I know where like Jesse is like in bed with his girlfriend and they have those yellow sheets. And like, I think he always has like yellow around when like his life is going really well and then it's like about to go really bad. So it's interesting. I didn't know this until I read about it, so like I'm not sure what it adds to the show, but it's interesting that people do things like this. This is if you want to read more about like color theory, this book is really heavy. It's like I have it upstairs, you guys can take a look at it, but this is like a great place to start. But I think that more than like reading color theory and you know going really deep into something like that, you can really just like teach yourself about color. What I do is I take photographs when I see like interesting colors interacting in the world, and I do that because I think it's important to get off of screens when viewing color, which is not to vilify screens. I don't vilify screens actually at all, but I do think that, you know, like looking at colors on screens is different. Like they're backlit, there's like a different, like small, you know, like it's just different. So I think it's important to be like awake and looking at color around you and then like keeping it for reference. And then I document my own work, partially because it's just like good practice and it's good to have those things for your portfolio and to move forward, but also to be able to go back and look at what you've done and learn from it and be like, oh, like that really worked. Or because sometimes you get so in a project, things feel really good, and then when you come out and you look back at it, you're like that color maybe shouldn't have been there, or like we really could have worked with this a little bit better. So really teaching yourself. And I think that the most important thing as a production designer is learning how to stand your ground. So if you're, like I said, if you're a production designer, you are a department head. So you are like just as important as the director, as the producer, as like you are one of the people that's shaping what this film is. Like you are creating the cohesive visual language. So don't be afraid to say no to people, especially when you get in a situation where it's tough and you have like directors who have their, especially co-directors will have like different visions and producers. And if you let everyone kind of come in and put their ideas in, everything usually everything falls apart. So it's important to be able to say no, which is especially difficult as like a woman in the industry. So I recommend taking up like boxing or something like that. I recommend having a practice outside of your art just in general that makes you feel like a strong and individualized person, so that when you run into situations like this, you can just be like, no, I'm not doing that. And moving on. So that's a little bit about production design. Do you guys have any questions about production design? What questions do you have? Or we could save them for later. Or I could just stare at you all until you have questions.
I guess like just offhand, do like in those situations with the director and everything, like, can you speak to any specifically that comes to mind that you were like, no, I really need this, or yes, you're right, like conceiving to the director's vision?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it is like, especially if the director wrote the film, like at the end of the day, I will, if it's not a huge thing, I'll be like, okay, like fine, I'll do that. But there was like the short film I worked on recently. We were in Mama's house was what he called it. It was like the big mother figure, and she's like, her kids are going off to college. And so it's her house, like it's an adult's house. And there's like a sex scene between two of the characters in the bathroom. And there was one of the visual lines in the script was like, she looks up at the string lights above the vanity. And I was like, an adult woman would not have string lights in her bathroom. Like that is like college stuff. And I'm not going to do that. And he was great. He was just like, okay. And I was like, oh, phew, like, thank you. But I have had other directors where we will end up in like a fight where I'm like, that doesn't make sense. Like, I don't want to put that in the film. And they're like, well, it makes sense to me. And so you kind of like, are like, okay, well, like, and usually when I go and watch the film, like, yeah, it doesn't make sense. But like, what can you do?
Is there a point where you just go like, let's do both, like string lights, like see how it works for like post, or is that just like
not usually. I mean, that would be great, but there's usually just not enough time. Yeah. There's like never enough time on set, even when you think you have enough time. So it's like we got to do it, and we got to get out of here. So I would love to have that type of freedom. I always try and make my schedule with like space to dream, I call it, so we can like play in the space, and everyone's always like, "Okay, Jaina." But, like building a set, I've spent upwards of like 2 weeks probably building a space, and like designing a space usually takes like working on that film. I mean, we did a location scout, and then we all had lunch and we talked about things, and then I went like thrift shopping 2 or 3 times, and then I went into my basement and I found some stuff, and then I showed up to set like 3 hours before we were rolling, and then just like putting everything up in the space. So it's a lot. It feels really easy. Like every time I take a job, I'm like, oh yeah, I can just throw some stuff in a place and it's gonna look great. And then I'm always like, this is so much work. Oh God, what have I done? So that's working off of an existing space. So this is building spaces, which is like my favorite thing to do. I think working as a production designer is probably a lot more fun when you have a lot of money. Like working in a space that exists already when you can really buy stuff. But building spaces is my favorite thing. So we'll talk about how do you design a space. So first you have to come up with an idea. So where do ideas come from? I am of the belief that they don't arrive. You have to really find them. You have to cultivate a creative lifestyle. I have an aunt who's like a saleswoman. And one day she came up to me and she said, Jaina, I just have to know, like, where do your ideas come from? And I was like, oh, well, like, they don't really just come to me, like I really am spending all my time like thinking and working, and like I write down things when they come to me, and I stay open, and I'm like trying to feed my and she just like completely like, she just like went right over, like she was not interested anymore. Like she really wanted me to be like, oh, they just like show up at the door, and she'd be like, oh, okay. Like she was like, I want nothing to do with this. I think if you create a space where creativity can come, then you really never run out of ideas. But you do have to work hard for it. which I think is something that I wish people had like told me when I started, because there was like a good 3, 4, 5 years of my life where I didn't have great ideas, or I didn't have fully formed ideas. And I was like, well, I'll never be able to do this. Like, this is just never going to work out for me. But it's not true. They didn't really start coming to me until I had really like solidified a practice and really moved into like my own space. I really believe that the more you work, the more things come to you. And so I'm really like, especially like when I work with a team, people will sometimes like, we'll get stuck on something and we don't know how to move forward, or we don't know how to solve a problem, and there's like 30, 40 minutes of just like talking and thinking, and everyone's getting really stressed and we don't know what to do. And I'm always like let's just put our hands to the work and start moving, because then I think things will solve themselves. And I think ideas are like that too. Like if you're in motion, like they just keep coming. But if you're like just waiting and like trying to dig for them, they're like elusive, and they're like, oh no, I'm just gonna go over here and I'm gonna come over here. So staying open to yourself, like not getting caught on what ifs. And if I feel stuck, then I just start moving, whether that's like working on a project that already exists, or maybe a project that I like put aside for a while, or just like cleaning the studio. Just like, I think movement makes more movement. This is one of my favorite books. I didn't bring this book, but this is one of my favorite books for finding ideas. David Lynch does a lot of meditation, which I personally don't do, but I can see how it would be beneficial to like a creative process. But I just love this quote because he talks about how ideas come in tiny pieces. And it's just really nice to hear like someone who I would consider to be a master like talk like that. Like he's not like, oh yeah, like Blue Velvet, like the whole film just came to me. Like I just like woke up and I was like, oh, and then I wrote it all down. Like, I don't know if you guys feel like project that onto people, but I definitely project that onto people where it's like, well, like my idea is not good because it didn't come fully formed. But even David Lynch, like he's like, it'd be great if the entire film came at once, but for me it comes in fragments. It's a piece of the puzzle that indicates the rest. I don't, that just for me is like very hopeful. Like, oh, okay, like we can start small and we can move forward. So like say you do all of that and you still don't have an idea. That's totally fine. Find an image you like and recreate it. You're gonna learn more through doing, like I said, than you're ever gonna learn through thinking. And I think it's important to copy the masters or whoever it is you really like, so you can figure out what is it you like about that and how can you like take a piece of that into your own practice and like move forward and, you know, create your own style without like copying people forever. But it's fine to copy people sometimes. So great, now you have an idea or an image that you want to work off. You can either get right to work and just figure it out as you go, or you can plan it out. I do both. I used to really just like go to work. I had like this big basement studio and I would just go down in there and just like unhinge my brain and just see what we could do. And it's only been recently this last year where I've started planning things out. And it's not even because I like planning things out. It's really just because like I don't have enough time. And I feel like I have to be really intentional with my time. So I think there's merit to working both ways and whatever works for you. So I'll take you guys through an idea that, two things that I built so you can kind of see like what my process is like. So this was a design that we made this summer. At the beginning of the summer, we decided we were going to build a big wall. It was 10 by 16 feet, so it was huge. We were going to do either 5 or 3 of these like diamond shaped cutouts, which are the logo for my business, because we're doing like a lot of portfolio building stuff right now. And the idea was that we were going to have, I don't know, at least 20 feet of space behind this wall, so we could have the people be like different sizes. So like they could run at the camera and we could like turn lights on and lights off. And it just became evident like pretty quickly that like this was not going to work. Like we did not have the time or the space or the tools. We really wanted to cut this out with like a CNC machine and make the little diamonds like really smooth and really beautiful, and we couldn't get access to the machine. And so I was like, okay, we have to change our idea. So I was like, what can we do that's going to be dynamic and large scale, but that would also fit on a horizontal frame? So like my team, people came up with like 40 or 50 different shapes, but they were all shapes that would fit in like a square frame. And I was like, we're doing video, so it has to be something that would fit horizontally. So the only shape that felt dynamic and visual was an eyeball. And so we kind of like, we wanted to do something else with the eyeball. And then my friend Kira, who was working with us, was like, what if it was like the sparkle in the eye? And so then that was like, I was like, here we go. So we've kind of hit it. So we spent, I think building this took 4 8-hour days. and then painting it and erecting it was like a whole other thing. But it required more math than I'm usually comfortable with. And in the end, we actually figured out a way to cut those shapes. Like you can see that's the same shape that before we were like, oh, we can't do that shape. We found a way to cut that shape out without using a CNC machine anyways. We used like a router with a jig. And this is how I pick my colors out. So I have a big box of paint swatches. Like I got those paint fans from Sherwin-Williams and I cut them up and I have them all separate. I should have brought it. I have them all separated into different colors. And so you can pick your colors and like lay them out on a nice white surface and kind of see how they play together. I try and stick to 5 colors per set. Like obviously you can break that rule and do whatever you want, but I think 5 is a good, things start to feel a little bit complicated when you move past 5 or a little bit like incohesive. So we spent 4 days building this. One day was like just measurements, one day was cutting it out, another day was like building the frames in the back, and then my good friend Lucas and I put this together. It was definitely a 3 or 4 person job, but just the way scheduling worked, there was nobody else. And so we created like a pulley system and screwed this to the wall. And I think it took us 4 hours to put this up. And I didn't think it was going to happen. This is one project where I really, every step of the way, I was like, this isn't going to work. And it did work. And so I don't have footage of it yet because it hasn't been edited, but we created like a spinning spiral behind it. And we put this diffusion paper on the front and then we had someone behind the eyeball. And it came out really well at the end of the day. So it's worth it doing really stressful things. So it can make really cool things happen. So we did that. And last year, we built these light walls. So somebody had given me, I mean, it must be like 2,000 or 3,000 like incandescent light bulbs. They were from the Prudential Center Christmas tree. They must have converted to LED, which I learned through this project why they would convert to LED. But this was an inspiration image from like a TV show, Dirk Gently, and they had these light walls that crushed the 2 characters. And I was like, oh, we're gonna make some light walls for this music video. So we Is everything else? No, okay. Well, okay. This is us cutting 1,600 holes in wood. Everyone was really mad at me at the end of the day. I had a really great time, but the team did not have a good time. And then we just like poked the light bulbs through and we put them all together. And they were huge, and I'm very lucky I don't really have any like formal training in any of this stuff. I really taught myself like how to build things and how to design things. And so I feel really lucky I have like an engineer boyfriend who, when I'm like, how are we gonna get these walls to stand up? Like goes and does a bunch of math for me and figures out like weight distribution so nobody dies in the process. But like I said, I think the Prudential Center probably switched to LED lights because I plugged these in the day before we were supposed to shoot, and I blew like every circuit in the building. And I was like, oh, right, they're incandescent bulbs. So each one, like I think each wall wanted like 8 circuits, which is just insane. So the building, Western Ave, was nice enough to do a power drop for us, which I still don't know why they did it, but it was very kind of them. So we had this like electrical panel in the studio for one day, and I was like, I'm gonna do something else with these walls, and I came back the next morning, it was gone. I was like, okay, so I'm not gonna do anything else with that. But yeah, we had 2 of them, and we pushed them together, and they were very hot, and nobody died. It was great. I'll talk a little bit about just like a few things that are things I wish someone had told me when I started building, because I just like tried to figure things out on myself. So when you're building walls, they're called flats. There's a couple different types of flats. These ones are Hollywood flats. These ones are theater flats. Theater flats are a lot lighter. They're a lot harder to square off. A lot of times they're covered in fabric, but you can cover them in plywood. And then these are Hollywood flats. So they're easier to make look like a real room, which I've learned through accidentally building mostly theater flats and being like, why is everything wonky? I don't do this, but I know a lot of people who do miniatures. So they're a great way to create something really awesome for just like a small price point. A lot of big budget films do this too. This is my friend Kendall. who also works in film. She's a production designer too, but this is some like miniature work of hers that I just think is incredible. I'd love to do more miniature stuff. It's like a whole nother thing you have to collect and have, you know, like I have to have all this other stuff. This is a production designer who works in LA, and I wish I had a video of this, but he created this rolling drum, and then it had the drum roll, and then he had the drum rolling as like the singer was like walking on a treadmill behind it. So you kind of have this like miniature like cartoon world like rolling as she's walking. I just think it's like the coolest thing in the whole world, and I would love someone to ask me to build them something like that. And they're great for explosions. So we did this in the studio parking lot like a month ago. Again, not sure why they let me do these things in the studio, but I'm very grateful for Western Ave. Thank you, Western Ave. But yeah, can't afford to set a house on fire. Try a dollhouse. There's a lot of tools you can use to build things like this, but I think one of the easiest saws to use is a jigsaw. It's definitely less scary than a lot of other saws, especially if you're like just starting out using tools. It's great for cutting out complex shapes, but you could chop something with it. You could cut like a piece of wood in half. They're great, especially like when you're starting out, because I think you would probably notice as you're cutting your finger off, like it doesn't move fast enough to just like, and then your finger's on the other side of the room. You'd be like, ow, like that hurt. You'd probably still get hurt, but you wouldn't lose your finger. And that's like my main goal, is to never lose a finger. What's happening to these images? So weird. But these are some things that I cut out using a jigsaw. Some of them are upstairs. We'll play with them later. But you can really cut any shape out with a jigsaw. It's a very versatile tool. So we talked a little bit about like color in spaces that already exist, but when you're building something, this is really the time when you get to like, you get to pick like every color, which is very exciting. So I always ask myself first, like, do we want it warm? Do we want it cool? Warm colors are gonna make your space feel smaller. Cool colors are gonna open it up. And then glossy or matte. Glossy obviously is gonna show more color, and matte is gonna photograph better. So if I'm building a set that's going to be photographed or filmed, it's matte paint all the way. They think I'm like crazy at Home Depot because I'll show up with like a list of like literally like 14 paints, and I'm like a gallon of each one, like as flat as possible. And they're like, okay, that's fine. If you're picking paint chips, always pick them on like a white background. Try and have good light. Color is great you can reuse things. So, you know, we don't have a lot of money, so if we can paint something, we can use it again. The color in set design is used to capture attention, which I think is different than in the real world and in interior design. So use that to your advantage. The light and color are really like what's going to draw a viewer to a space. So be bold with it, but don't be obvious with it. Complementary colors. I love working with complementary colors. They can really like, you bring a little pop to a space or help balance things out. This is pretty much the solution to like 9 out of 10 color problems. I feel like if you're looking at a space and you're like, man, this like feels flat and weird, it's like, well, complementary color, I'll fix it. And vibrating colors. This is like complementary colors to the extreme. So they create like the illusion of motion and can make you feel very unsettled. It's great. They're great to use, and they're not so fun to paint. So if like staring at a wall painting this for like an hour is not fun. But when it's done, you're like, oh, that looks great. I think it's important too to just remember that you can do this, and you can teach yourself anything. I really did teach myself almost all of this. I got lucky. There were a couple guys in my life who like put up with me just asking a million bazillion questions and kindly answered them. But you can teach yourself anything. If you have curiosity over perfectionism, and you're willing to mess up, and you're willing to be in a space where like you don't know what you're doing, then like you will be totally fine. I get a lot of people ask me to like do like a power tool class because they're very afraid of like picking up their first power tool, which I'd love to do. But most of it is just common sense, like just going slow and making sure that you are aware of your surroundings and you just had, you ate a good meal and your blood sugar is not low and you're not sleepy, like you just be like, do I feel okay? Like, yes, I can use tools now. And just starting slow and, read the manuals and watch the like 25-minute long YouTube videos that like old men make on YouTube for every tool. But I think the best thing for me, like when I started learning this stuff, was that the growth is really exponential. And there's like a language to building. When I started out, it felt very overwhelming, which was disheartening and exciting. But it was very much like there's so much to learn about building and spaces and tools and materials that like I'm never going to figure it all out. But it's kind of like learning a language where you learn. It just kind of like builds off of itself. So once you know a few things, you can kind of figure out how to puzzle out anything else. And it's like once you use a few tools, then it's like you kind of know how to pick up other tools. Like you don't start from zero like every time. And I think it's just really enheartening. I don't know if like that's a word. It's really heartfelt. Any questions about building things? What questions do you guys have about building? I know you have questions. I have questions.
Would you be able to speak to a set that you like had a vision and like got like 3/4 away, and then for some reason or another, like either like you built the whole thing and then it like wasn't how you envisioned it, or is it always just like as you go, you're sort of checking in with checkpoints?
I definitely these days I'm always checking in with checkpoints for sure. And I feel like I've gotten pretty good at recognizing like what the warning signs are and just like listening to my gut. I think sometimes I once read an article where this guy was talking about doing like home improvement stuff. And he was like, you'll never be able to DIY if you're the type of person who gets to the end of something and it's wrong and you have to start over and you're like cursing and like and you're very upset. Like you have to be like okay, like that sucks, like I'm gonna take it down, I'm gonna move past it. And I think like that's a big warning sign in me when I have like I'll be looking at something I've done and I'm like, ooh, like I kind of wish it was this other way. And then that thing in me is like, well, that looks like a lot of work, we shouldn't do that. That's when I know I like have to do it. If there's no voice in me that like kind of says like no, then I'm like, which is weird. Like if the voice doesn't say no, then I'm like, oh, maybe it can work. But if the voice is like, no, it seems like a lot of work, we really shouldn't do that, I'm like, fuck, we have to do it now. No, but definitely like when I was starting out, there would be times where like I used to not plan things. Like I used to like schedule a shoot. Someone would be showing up at my house at say like 7 p.m. and I'd get home from work at 2:30 and I'd like drink a coffee. And I would go in the basement and I would just start building and I would have no like preconceived plan. It's just like some stuff I thrifted and some things I had. And sometimes you throw something together and be like, this is not great. Does not feel super great. And then sometimes someone would come into the space and totally change it. It'd be like the right space for the right person. And you'd be like, great, this is awesome. And then sometimes you would create a great space that you really loved and someone would come in and it's just like the wrong space for them. And you're like, this is not working at all. So I've gotten a lot better at figuring out like who's going to be in this space. And things take longer to build. Like I'm building bigger things, so I have more time to think about it too. So, but yeah, I've definitely messed up. I've been like, oops.
Well, good to know. Cool that you feed off other people and be like, oh, some guy probably more, some less. So.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I love to work with people. Like I think that everything's like a performance, and if you can make your performer feel better with the space, then they're going to give you a better performance, and it's going to be great.
Do you have any little projects or other tools you'd recommend for people starting out on a first project?
Tools or projects? Like what? Like example?
Yeah, like building a flat versus like building a prop. I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of like what someone should start off with.
Sure. Building flats is easy. It looks really complicated. It looks complicated, but it's not. It's easy. So And you can really get away with like doing it not so great too, especially if you're gonna be the one manning the camera. Like if something didn't work out or like something is askew or wonky, it's like, okay, it's just not gonna be in frame. Flats are really easy to build. Building flats that are like cut out of shit. Like the Jigsaw really is the easiest saw to use. It goes slow. You can really like, you can move it around. You just move it around and you just twist it and you can really cut any shit. When I figured out the Jigsaw, I was like, oh, like my whole life has changed. Like I can make anything. And foam too, like using insulation foam, which I feel like used to be cheaper. Now nothing is cheap, like wood or foam, nothing is cheap at all. But getting like a hot knife and carving with foam if you're feeling like a jigsaw is too much or you're not into blades, that works too. Just wear a mask so you don't breathe in melty. Yes. Yes. I always like save a lot of styrofoam and then I don't use it in time and then I'm like, oh, I have to get rid of it because it takes up a lot of space. I'll give it to you next time. Really? Oh. All right, I'll give you all my Oh. So once you've started building or designing or working in this space, it's natural to want to cultivate your own style. That's what's going to set you apart as a designer. This takes a long time, so don't be disheartened, but pay attention to what attracts you. Like, what are you interested in? Record it, photograph it, write it down, put it in a folder, print it out, whatever the organizational structure works for you. I keep a scene study notebook. Well, I keep probably too many notebooks, but I keep a scene study notebook where when I'm watching TV or consuming any type of media, if something really works for me, I'll write down what it is and then why I think it worked, whether it's like writing or character development or something visual or something lighting wise, so that I can go back and try and figure out like, what is it that I really want to create in this world? And then obviously copying your masters so you can move beyond them. Bad art's better than no art. You can't predict your masterpiece. Like you never know when you're going to create something that you really love. Like you can't predict that from how you feel when you start out. Maybe you guys can. I can't. I have no idea. So I think it's always important to keep moving forward and know that even if things don't work out, like the next thing is going to be better. Like obviously it's all about practice, and perfectionism is a trap. It's just like a big nasty trap you can fall into. It's no good for anybody. It doesn't help anything. Nothing is ever going to be perfect. And like moving into that headspace and trying to make things perfect is just going to drive you like absolutely crazy. Everything has been done before, but it hasn't been done by you. So I think starting out, I know it was this way for me. I think it's this way for a lot of people, especially like when you're in art school. It's like, I have to do something brand new. Like this has to be like something like nobody has ever seen before. But like nobody cares about that. Like people want to see authenticity, people want to see connection, people want things to feel real, and people want to hear your story and see what you're making. Like no, if you're not like directly copying someone and being really contrived, like nobody is going to be like, oh, like I've seen this before. Like people want to hear, like you guys want to hear people's authentic stories. Like I want to hear people's authentic stories. I'm not really out there going to art museums being like, oh, like it's just brand new. Like that's like a really weird way to view things. Some of the best writing advice I ever got was to stay where it hurts, which is hard, but I think that's where really great art comes from. So I work on exploring myself ceaselessly, trying to figure out like what is your story, like what do you want to share with the world, and to not shy away from the things that you're afraid of. And so like the cave you're afraid to enter holds the treasure you seek. So like gently go into that space. I took that quote really literally when I was growing up, and definitely like went way too hard into things inside myself that like really I should have been gentler with. So just like don't shy away from fear, but moving into things gently and remembering that your story is worth telling. Did I make a baby cry? You're talking about my fear? That's how I feel. And trust your gut. So a lot of this work designing, especially production design, is just like gut feeling, and I wish there was more logic to it. Like I wish I could tell, like this is pretty much, I feel like I put most of the logic that I know into this presentation. I wish there was more, but a lot of it is just being able to look at something and know whether it's right or wrong for the space. And it's a cultivated skill. It gets better over time, but just trusting yourself and trusting your instincts and asking for help when you need to, and knowing that like you're always going to look back on your work and be like, oh, that could have been better. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your work. And having fun. I feel like people don't talk about this enough, that if you're working really hard on something, it should be fun. So doing any type of art is really hard, but especially production design, like especially building things and learning new skills, designing a space, it's really hard work. And if you're not having fun, you're not going to be able to like work through those problems that come up and like work through all of the things that are really difficult about the process. So figure out what you want to see, like what makes you laugh, what makes you happy, what makes you curious or upset, and build those spaces. Like be connected to your spaces and enjoy the process of failing and learning and doing the whole thing, or you're just going to like drive yourself crazy. So that's pretty much my presentation, but I would, if you guys like this or if you like me, you can come join me at my first set design show, which is happening on September 8th at BU. So I'm going to be building 4 sets that you guys can come into and take photos in, or just like sit in and close your eyes and cry, like whatever it is you feel like you want to do in my spaces. And then I also have an artist talk at the Beacon Street Gallery on September 20th, which should be really great. I have some of my photos up there, and the gallery is in front of a dispensary. So if that piques anybody's interest, you can make a day out of it. And that's it. That's it. That's all there is to production design. There's nothing more. That was the master class. I'm totally kidding. There's so much more. I wish there were more books on it. I brought every book that I've ever found on it for you guys to look at upstairs.